It seems hard to imagine now, but back in late 2017 and early 2018, it really felt as if the United States might go to war with North Korea. This was the era of the Hawaii missile alert, when an accidental warning message sent thousands scrambling for shelter. An era when serious newspapers ran articles outlining how a DPRK nuclear attack might affect the American homeland. When it seemed Kim Jong-un's regime constituted the greatest threat to the US and its allies anywhere on Earth. Jump forward today, and such a view now seems almost quaint. With Russia grinding forwards in Ukraine, Iran near the brink of an all-out war with Israel, and China eyeing Taiwan like a shark, the North Korean threat feels more distant than ever, a relic of a bygone time. Yet such feelings can be deceiving. As you watch this, a small but significant number of experts are sounding the alarm on the DPRK. Rather than recede, they warn that the threat from Pyongyang is only growing stronger, that the next great crisis might not emerge in the Middle East or in Europe, but rather on the Korean Peninsula. For a specialist publication like 38 North, the report released this January was about as close to a blockbuster as it's possible to get. Written by seasoned DPRK experts Robert L. Carlin and Siegfried S. Hacker, and published under the no-nonsense title, Is Kim Jong-un Preparing for War?, the article laid out in painstaking detail why the two analysts felt that conflict on the Korean Peninsula was now inevitable. In their words, quoting, "The situation on the Korean Peninsula is more dangerous than it has been at any time since early June 1950. That may sound overly dramatic, but we believe that, like his grandfather in 1950, Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to go to war." So big was the impact of this report that it swept around the globe. We covered it ourselves on our weekly Situation Room briefing, where we made a point of noting that while Carlin and Hacker are indeed experts, plenty of others disagreed with their apocalyptic conclusion. In the few months since that 38 North essay, though, a few others have stepped forwards to back some of their conclusions. Not many, but enough to make this topic worth revisiting. War on the Rocks, for example, recently carried a piece arguing that, quoting, "A crisis in Northeast Asia is more likely to start on the Korean Peninsula, not in Taiwan." The Atlantic Council, meanwhile, recently argued that the North Korean ICBM threat is greater than Congress realizes, and that America is falling behind in its ability to defend against it. But while these articles are all interesting and somewhat terrifying, they pale next to the real-world evidence that Pyongyang is becoming increasingly dangerous. In just the last few months, the regime's rhetoric and actions have climbed to unhinged heights not seen since the 2017 crisis. The focus of the DPRK's latest threats has mostly been its neighbor, South Korea, a US treaty ally where tens of thousands of American troops are stationed. In January, Kim Jong-un had the constitution changed to name South Korea #1 hostile state. That same month, he ordered the ministry responsible for Korean reunification to be permanently shuttered and had the reunification monument in Pyongyang bulldozed into the ground for good measure. While such bombastic actions may seem pretty par for the course for Kim, they represent a sea change in decades of DPRK policy, the official abandonment of reunification as a goal. In its place, Kim now declares he plans to, quote, "completely occupy, subjugate, and reclaim South Korea and annex it as part of the territory of our republic." These threatening words have been matched by actions that seem designed to cause anxiety in Seoul. In January alone, the regime tested new underground attack drones and fired artillery at Yongpyong Island, causing 200 South Koreans to be evacuated. More recently, May the 2nd saw Seoul issue a terror alert for its diplomatic missions after intelligence suggested North Korea might be plotting to attack a South Korean embassy or consulate in 5 nearby nations. To be clear, even if the DPRK were to attack a South Korean embassy, it would not be an unprecedented escalation. Back in the 1960s, North Korean commandos carried out a raid on the president's residence, killing 30 people. In the 1980s, Pyongyang bombed a South Korean airliner, killing 115. Closer to our own time, the North shelled Yongpyong Island in 2010, killing 2 South Korean soldiers and 2 civilians. In all these cases, and many others that we don't have time to list, the death and destruction wrought by Pyongyang failed to spark a new Korean conflict. Awful as renewed violence against the South would be, it's unlikely to escalate into a global crisis. Yet renewed threats against the South are just one aspect of Kim's current behavior that is worrying analysts. Zoom out to the wider geopolitical picture, and it starts to look a whole lot like Pyongyang is becoming a more active player than it has been in years. There's a lot of debate in certain circles right now as to whether we're heading towards or are already in a second Cold War. Since it's the sort of topic that would require a whole video, we're not going to weigh up both sides here. What we will say, though, is that new Cold War or not, North Korea is certainly acting like one might be underway. Over the past couple of years, Pyongyang has started cozying up to major players in the anti-Western world order. The biggest development? North Korea's blossoming relationship with Russia. Since last summer, Moscow has been turning to Pyongyang to supply it with artillery ammunition. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates at least 10,000 containers have made their way from the DPRK's stockpiles and to Russia's front lines, consisting of millions of shells. The trade-off has been Russia using its Security Council veto to kill a UN panel tasked with monitoring Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program. There are also concerns that, as foreign policy put it, the Kremlin could buck decades of non-proliferation norms and start supplying Pyongyang with sensitive military technology on ballistic missiles and submarines. But while the Kim-Putin bromance has been big news, Russia isn't the only new ally North Korea is getting close to. This April, Pyongyang's Minister of External Economic Relations appeared in Iran, the first visit by a DPRK official to the Islamic Republic in half a decade. According to the US State Department, the trip's economic focus may have been a smokescreen for possible missile and nuclear technology cooperation. In Pyongyang, such technology is certainly developing fast. Although North Korean weapons spent most of the previous decade as the butt of jokes, current DPRK tech is getting worryingly powerful. This spring saw the regime successfully test its new solid-fuel hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missile, the WarFronts 16B. Solid-fuel missiles are advantageous because they're easier to move and store and can be fired with little preparation time. By mastering them, North Korea makes it harder for the US or its allies to detect and destroy their arsenal in the opening minutes of any conflict, thereby increasing Pyongyang's ability to attack American assets. In the case of the Hwasong 16B, its range is long enough that those assets could be anywhere in Japan or Guam. Home to multiple US military bases and over 70,000 combined personnel, Japan and Guam are thought to be prime targets for a preemptive strike in DPRK military planning. Then there are the longer-range missiles, the ones that could hit the US homeland. Back in December, Deutsche Welle reported on a new North Korean ICBM test that could place the whole of North America at risk. Technically, Kim has had this ability since 2017, but the new Hwasong 18 is bigger and more powerful than previous missiles. Now, this doesn't mean a North Korean nuclear strike against the US would necessarily go according to plan. Bloomberg notes that, quote, it's unclear whether the country's ICBMs could beat US anti-missile systems and are refined enough to strike their intended targets, as well as whether the warheads could survive re-entry into the atmosphere. Still, the point isn't that Kim could obliterate Los Angeles or New York today, but that his missile technology is rapidly improving, perhaps to the point where the regime could soon pose a real threat to American cities. This is one reason why experts fear 2024 may yet bring another extremely unwelcome development, a new North Korean nuclear test. So far in its history, the DPRK has tested 6 nuclear devices. The most recent, and by far the most powerful, was in September of 2017. Since then, the North's tech has improved and its stockpile has grown. From a mere 40 to 50 warheads, the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis now estimates that Pyongyang has between 80 and 90 nukes. Since 2020, the UN has assessed that the North has probably succeeded in miniaturizing its warheads to fit onto ballistic missiles. A 7th test, then, could be the next step in Kim's provocations, and likely a highly destabilizing one. War on the Rocks suggests it might be time to coincide with this year's presidential election, and it's here that we get to a worrying aspect of the North Korean threat. When the word threat is used in the Korean context, many of us just assume that the logical outcome of this is renewed war on the peninsula. But as we're about to see, there are many other ways Pyongyang could engineer a crisis without launching an armed attack on its neighbors. A crisis which, although smaller than all-out war, could still impact the entire world. The arrival of North Korean missiles in the Ukraine war was bad for a number of reasons. The obvious one is that it gave Russia a munitions boost at a time when Ukraine was closing the gap between them. But it's not just because of their direct impact on Ukraine's front lines that Pyongyang's shipments caused consternation. In a January 10th meeting of the UN Security Council, South Korea's representative pointed out that Russia's use of DPRK weapons was allowing Kim to test his stockpile in a real-life war. That, in turn, was feeding back reams of useful data to the North Koreans, allowing them to improve their missiles. Seoul's concern was, obviously, that these weapons would one day be used against them. Yet it's not only South Korea that should be worried. Now that Kim has pulled off a successful arms deal with Russia, there are concerns that his regime might try to shop its weapons to other global conflicts. The Washington Post writes that every time a North Korean weapon kills a Ukrainian, that's a sales pitch for Pyongyang's weapons industry to any aggressor with cash on hand. Not so long ago, the idea of states scrambling to buy North Korean weapons would have raised a bit of a wry smile. With rockets prone to misfire and heavy UN sanctions in place, few nations would have thought it worth their while. What's good enough for Russia is likely to be good enough for other nations like Iran. And Russia's Security Council veto also means that the UN won't be able to do anything about it. This is one scarily plausible way that Pyongyang could destabilize multiple regions of the world. Not by launching nuclear attacks, but by shifting weapons to other rogue regimes that could then be used to prolong conflicts. Given the sanctions busting that this would involve, even the mere act of making these shipments would chip away at the international order. Another possibility revolves around Kim's favorite toy in his arsenal, nuclear weapons. We mentioned last chapter how Pyongyang might conduct a nuclear test this year, an event that could be timed to coincide with the US presidential election. That in and of itself would be a dangerous provocation. But a greater danger might come in the aftermath. If post-election America takes a sharp isolationist turn just as Kim is testing his nukes, then we could potentially see a nuclear arms race on the Korean Peninsula. At the moment, the presence of tens of thousands of American troops in South Korea, backed up by a defense treaty, means Seoul feels comfortable that Kim will not attack. Doing so would require killing so many American soldiers that Washington would undoubtedly launch a massive counterstrike that would annihilate the North Korean regime. But a Trump victory in 2024 might change the calculation. As AP News points out, Trump spent his previous term floating the idea of withdrawing all US troops from South Korea if Seoul didn't pay billions extra. On top of that, Pyongyang's growing ability to launch nukes that could hit the American homeland has South Korean military planners worried that an isolationist president wouldn't even consider counterattacking, lest Kim fire a missile that could destroy Washington. The former leader of South Korea's special forces seemed to sum up these fears best when he told the Financial Times, "I have never doubted an American soldier, but I would be foolish to place my nation's security in the hands of an American politician." With polls showing over 70% of South Koreans would support their country going nuclear, the most destabilizing thing Kim might wind up doing is pushing Seoul to get its own nukes, something President Yoon directly threatened in January 2023, declaring that Seoul would acquire our own nukes if the situation gets worse. Now you might reasonably ask why a nuclear South Korea would be a threat. After all, 4 states have acquired the bomb since the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons was signed, and 2 of them, India and Pakistan, arguably have an even worse relationship than the 2 Koreas. But just because India and Pakistan have so far refrained from nuclear war doesn't mean it's a good idea for multiple states to get the bomb. Every new nuclear state increases the possibility of someone someday miscalculating and unleashing large-scale destruction. And there's good reason to think South Korea acquiring nukes would act as a starting gun for other nations. To use just one local example, Japan is likely to also consider getting the bomb if Seoul does. In this way, a toxic combination of America turning inwards just as Kim is ratcheting up his bellicose rhetoric could lead to broader nuclear proliferation. So, those are 2 ways, short of full-scale nuclear war, that North Korea could destabilize the wider world. But while we've focused in this chapter on the lower-level ways Pyongyang could still pose a threat, that doesn't mean we should ignore the obvious ones. And that's right. So, it's time to try thinking about the near unthinkable, to consider whether there's any chance that Kim could actually start a full-scale war. Now, one of the fascinating things about a potential war on the Korean Peninsula is just how much each side's theory of victory relies on massive preemptive strikes. Since 2012, South Korea has adopted something called the 3-axis system, which calls for attacks on the North's nuclear bases before conflict even breaks out, as well as the quick decapitation of Pyongyang's leadership using either precision missiles or special forces teams. On the other side of the border, Kim's regime is also thought to predicate all of its war planning on bold early moves that will neutralize opponents. In 2022, Pyongyang made its nuclear use policy public for the first time, and it turns out that Kim's conditions for a strike are liberal as hell. As the Atlantic Council explains, take it at face value, this means North Korea's ICBM force commanders may already be authorized if North Korean command and control sites are struck by US or South Korean forces to attack the Pentagon and the White House without an explicit order from Kim Jong-un. There's also the question of whether the North would unleash a first strike. With South Korea's better-equipped army likely to win any conventional conflict, analysts have long assumed that Kim's only logical path to victory involves deploying his weapons of mass destruction in the opening moments and hoping the shock and awe effect forces a quick surrender. That means the regime is incentivized to gamble everything on bold actions. At the lower end of the scale, this could involve detonating a tactical nuclear device as a warning. At the higher end, it could involve preemptive nuclear strikes not just against South Korea, but also Japan and American forces stationed in Guam. The death toll from a conflict that opened in this way would be eye-popping, far exceeding the combined death toll from every other war fought so far this century. In an instant, Seoul and Tokyo would go up in flames, killing millions. Minutes later, tens of thousands of American troops stationed on Guam would be obliterated. Since Kim's shock and awe approach is unlikely to make his enemies back down, this would quickly be followed in turn by the destruction of Pyongyang, itself home to nearly 3 million people. By then, though, multiple ICBMs might already be flying towards America. While most would be shot down or malfunction, even one or two getting through could result in whole American cities being wiped out. We mention this not just to be apocalyptic, but to show how quickly a renewed Korean conflict could escalate into millions of deaths on two different continents. Because North Korea and South Korea have doctrines that call for preemptive, debilitating strikes on the enemy, there is almost no way the war could remain conventional. Whoever hesitates could either see their entire leadership killed or their capital city wiped out, forcing both to go all in from the conflict's opening moments. Here's how War on the Rocks explains the way a new Korean crisis could quickly escalate. A crisis will quickly spiral out of control through an action-reaction dynamic. Even if Kim Jong-un does not intend to initiate a major crisis, a limited conflict can rapidly escalate into a bigger crisis than Kim himself may anticipate. Or, as political science professor at Pusan University, Robert Kelly told AP News, there is probably no conventional-only scenario in Korea anymore. North Korea would rapidly lose a conventional conflict. Pyongyang knows this, dramatically raising the likelihood that it will use nuclear weapons first, at least tactically. All this means a second Korean war wouldn't look like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, nor would it look like the war in Gaza. It would probably get much bigger, much faster, and quickly suck in multiple nations. It's this ability to spiral out of control so rapidly that makes the North Korean threat so relevant today, so capable of keeping analysts awake at night. The good news is that none of this will necessarily come to pass. While Pyongyang may remain a threat, it's entirely possible that this threat won't ever grow into the kind of planet-engulfing crisis that we're discussing here. For all some serious analysts may believe the Kim regime represents a significant current risk, there are other analysts who are convinced the tyrant is less likely today to make problems than at any other time in recent history. You don't start a war when you're sending vast amounts of munitions and missiles to another country to help them fight a war. That's the opinion of Stimson Center senior fellow Jenny Town, quoted here via the Washington Post, on the likelihood that Kim Jong-un might be preparing to attack South Korea. For all analysts like Robert L. Carlin and Siegfried S. Hecker might be raising the alarm based on the regime's rhetoric, Towns' position is based more on Pyongyang's actions. Right now, those actions consist of draining its own stockpiles to supply Russia in its war against Ukraine. As Town put it, why would Kim do that if he's gearing up to invade the South? The answer, in this telling at least, is that attacking South Korea is the last thing on Kim's mind. Instead, the tyrant is more focused on building up the North's military manufacturing capacity so he can reap profits selling missiles to Moscow and other capitals at war. As we pointed out earlier, this isn't a great outcome. Such arms dealing by Pyongyang could be destabilizing for the wider world. But at least it's a better outcome than believing Kim is gearing up for an all-out war. As for the increasingly harsh rhetoric towards the South, as well as the testing of missiles designed to hit the United States, Town suggests this is just a fig leaf for ramping up weapons manufacturing. As the Washington Post put it, by raising tensions with Washington and Seoul, Kim can justify his use of North Korea's money and industry for its weapons business rather than feeding its people. This is broadly similar to the conclusion other analysts have drawn. The Center for Strategic and International Studies believes the anti-Seoul rhetoric is also a cover for something else, only not weapons manufacturing. Rather, they believe the threats and dehumanization of South Koreans by the Kim regime are a deliberate attempt to justify a local crackdown on South Korean culture. Back in the 2010s, selling or watching pirated South Korean shows in North Korea was considered a crime, but not a particularly serious one. Punishments were lax by local standards, and those selling pirated shows in black markets could usually bribe their way out of trouble. In the 2020s, though, that is no longer the case. Today, using South Korean slang or wearing Southern-style clothes can get you sentenced to decades in a work camp. Teenagers have been executed for listening to K-pop. The reason for this abrupt shift is likely that the proliferation of K-dramas was slowly building awareness among young North Koreans that a different lifestyle is possible. Here's how CSIS explained it. The North Korean regime perceives South Korea ontologically as an existential threat. South Korea is a living model to North Koreans of what their country might be without the Kim family's regime. By creating the impression at home that war with Seoul is coming, Kim can justify cracking down heavily on anything connected to South Korea. In other words, all the recent bluster and bellicose ranting has been designed for an internal audience rather than an external one. Another final reason why a war might be off the cards comes from Bloomberg. In a recent article, the financially focused outlet delivered some surprising analysis. Kim might not want war because his economy is currently doing pretty good. By that, they didn't mean that North Korea is transforming into a communist paradise where no one wants for anything. Painstaking reporting by the BBC last year showed that conditions for the masses were so dire that people were starving to death in their Pyongyang apartments. But growing trade with Russia and China is contributing to the Kim family having more cash at its disposal than at any other recent time. The BMI group assesses that North Korea's economy grew by 0.5% in 2023, the most since tightened UN sanctions came into force in 2016. If that's the case, then why would the tyrant want to throw away everything by launching a war he must know that he's doomed to lose? At the end of all that, then, we can finally circle back round to our original question. Is the world underestimating the North Korean threat? The answer, as we've hopefully shown, isn't clear-cut. While many experts believe a full-scale war is unlikely, others aren't so sure. And it should be clear by now that Pyongyang has other ways to put the world on edge without resorting to a conflict. What is easier to see, though, is that even amid the multiple major conflicts underway today, the world should not take its eye off the Korean Peninsula. That while the immediate dangers of 2017 and 2018 may have passed, this still remains a powerful geopolitical flashpoint, one we may all have to remain aware of for a long time to come.